I pushed the heavy wooden door of the mansion open, and the soft creak echoed through the vast entrance hall. The air inside was sharp, almost biting, as though the walls themselves were holding on to secrets they were reluctant to reveal. This was meant to be my fresh start, a new chapter with Oliver, my husband. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being an intruder in this old grand house that had belonged to his family for generations. At first, Oliver had been so kind and attentive, but lately he seemed to disappear more into his work every day. He had promised me a life of stability and comfort, but instead I found myself feeling more isolated, like a stranger in my own home. I would wander the echoing halls, feeling small and out of place. It was during this time that I met Nathan, Oliver's son from his previous marriage. He appeared one morning tall and self-assured, with a gaze that seemed to pierce right through me. I tried to remain composed, but there was something unsettling about his presence, an attention that I couldn't quite define. Initially, I thought it was just the awkwardness of blending two families, the usual struggle of making two separate worlds coexist. But there was something more beneath the surface, something I couldn't name. Nathan's eyes lingered on me longer than they should have that first morning. "So you're the new wife?" he asked, a half-smile playing at the corners of his lips, though there was an undertone to it that I couldn't place. His words seemed simple enough, but his tone was low, suggestive, and it made a shiver run down my spine. I forced a smile, replying with a polite, "Yes, I'm Mia," trying to steady my nerves. "It's nice to meet you." His smile widened slightly, his gaze sharp as though he were sizing me up. "I'm sure it is," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes never left mine. A flush spread up my neck, a mix of embarrassment and something else I was unwilling to admit to myself. As the days went by, I did my best to avoid Nathan's gaze, but it seemed like he was always there, watching me with that unsettling intensity. He had this way of showing up wherever I was. Whether in the kitchen, the garden, or by the old library where I liked to read, he was always around. I told myself it was nothing more than coincidence. After all, we were living under the same roof now. But his gaze, the way his eyes followed me, made my heart race with a mixture of fear and something more dangerous. One evening, after Oliver had left on a business trip, I found myself alone in the living room. I tried to distract myself with a book, but I couldn't concentrate. I could feel Nathan's presence before I even saw him. His footsteps were quiet on the wooden floor as he entered, and he walked over to the window, staring out into the night. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with unspoken tension. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Do you ever wonder about this place, Mia? About its secrets?" A lump formed in my throat as I struggled to find a response. "Secrets?" I whispered, barely audible. He turned to face me, locking his eyes onto mine. "This house has witnessed a lot," he said, his voice carrying a challenge. "And I think it's starting to reveal some of them to you." His words hung in the air, a subtle invitation that made my pulse quicken. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was overthinking things. But the way he spoke, the intensity in his eyes, there was something shifting that I wasn't ready to confront. I stood up, desperate to break the tension, to stop whatever was beginning to happen before it went too far. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice shaky. He smiled a slow, knowing smile, sending another shiver down my spine. "Good night, Mia," he murmured, his voice soft, almost a whisper. As I walked away, I felt his eyes on my back. For a moment, I almost turned around, wanting to say something to challenge whatever game he was playing. But I didn't. I couldn't. Deep down, I feared what I might find in his eyes if I did. I tried to shake off the lingering feeling from that evening, but it clung to me like a shadow. I told myself I was imagining things, that Nathan's presence in the house was just another part of my new life, a complication I would have to navigate. And yet, I found myself thinking about him more than I should. His gaze, his smile, the way he seemed to see right through me. Some days dragged on endlessly. Oliver called from his trip, his voice warm but distant. I lied to him, telling him everything was fine, that I was settling in. But the more I said it, the more the emptiness inside me grew. The house, so large and imposing, felt like it was slowly closing in, its walls whispering secrets I wasn't meant to hear. One afternoon when I was alone, I decided to explore the old library once more. It had become my refuge, a place where I could escape into the stories of others, and forget the confusion in my own heart. As I ran my fingers over the spines of the dusty books, my hand brushed against something unusual. A small leather-bound notebook, half hidden behind a row of novels. My curiosity piqued. I pulled it out, feeling the soft, aged leather under my fingers. I opened it and immediately recognized it as a diary. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, and the ink was faded with time. I glanced at the first few entries and saw the name Clara repeated. Clara, Nathan's mother. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages, glimpsing her thoughts, fears, and love, and something darker, something I couldn't quite grasp. There was an unmistakable desperation in her words, a longing for freedom, an escape from a life she felt trapped in. A soft creak behind me made my heart leap into my throat. I spun around quickly, clutching the diary to my chest. Nathan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, like someone who had just uncovered a hidden truth. Are we? He asked, his voice teasing but edged with something sharper. I froze, feeling guilty as the flush of embarrassment crept up my neck. I didn't mean to, I stammered, my hands trembling. I just found it here. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. That's my mother's diary, he said quietly. She wrote it before she died. A chill ran down my spine. I'd heard the whispers about Clara's death, how tragic and sudden it had been, but no one had ever told me the full story. I hesitated, unsure whether to return the diary or keep it. Nathan's eyes softened and he moved closer, the warmth of his body just inches away from mine. Do you want to know the truth? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. About what happened to her. My throat tightened and before I could stop myself I whispered yes. He reached out and gently took the diary from my hands, his fingers brushing against mine. A jolt of electricity shot through me, and I quickly pulled my hand back. A flicker of a smile crossed his lips, and his eyes gleamed with something knowing. Come with me, he said, turning toward the door without waiting for an answer. I hesitated, torn between the urge to uncover the truth and the unsettling sense of danger his presence seemed to bring. But curiosity won out. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed him down a narrow hallway I hadn't noticed before. We arrived at a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house. It felt forgotten, untouched for years. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, my eyes scanning the room. Dust covered every surface, and the air felt heavy with the weight of long-held secrets. Nathan sat across from me, holding the diary, his expression serious. She was planning to leave, he began softly, his voice almost a whisper. She wanted to escape from my father, from this life. I studied his face, trying to read the emotions behind his words. There was pain there, but also something like determination. Why? I asked, my voice barely audible. He hesitated for a moment, then looked me straight in the eyes. Because she fell in love with someone else, he replied. Someone who promised her freedom. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer across the walls. And what happened? I asked, my voice trembling. Nathan leaned in, his gaze intense. She died before she could leave, he whispered, and no one knows why. The words hung in the air, and a heavy silence settled between us. I felt a whirlwind of emotions, fear, curiosity, and an unfamiliar pull toward him, a man full of secrets. He leaned even closer, his face inches from mine. Be careful, Mia, he murmured. This house has a way of making people do things they never thought they'd do. His words sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could respond, he pressed his lips to mine in a swift, unexpected kiss. I gasped, pulling away, my mind racing. But my body betrayed me, warmth flooding through me, making it impossible to ignore the feeling that lingered. Nathan's eyes searched mine, looking for something. An answer, a sign of approval. I didn't know what he was looking for, and I didn't know how to give it. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I have to go, I said, my voice shaking. He didn't stop me, but his eyes followed me, never leaving my back as I hurried out of the room and into the safety of my bedroom. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. Guilt, anger, and something else I didn't dare to name. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to shut out everything. But the taste of his lips still lingered, and I knew that whatever had started tonight wouldn't end easily. Sleep was elusive that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the memory of Nathan's kiss like a brand on my lips. I replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to justify it, to find some reason why I had let it happen. My emotions were a battlefield. Guilt for what I had done, fear of what it meant, and most disturbingly, the undeniable thrill that surged through me whenever I thought of him. By morning the house felt different. It had absorbed the tension from the night before, the air thick with what had transpired. As I moved through the rooms, I half expected Nathan to appear at every corner, but he was nowhere to be found. I wondered if he was feeling the same turmoil, or if his kiss had been nothing more than a game, a test of boundaries. When Oliver called to check in, his voice warm and concerned, I could barely speak. I muttered excuses, saying I was tired, that the house was keeping me busy. A sharp pang of guilt shot through me as I listened to his voice, distant and trusting, believing I was safe in our new home. The truth was far more complicated. After the call, I felt the need to distract myself, to drown out the noise in my mind. I wandered the house, hoping to find something, anything, to take my thoughts off Nathan. I found myself drawn back to the old library where I had first discovered Clara's diary. I opened it again, tracing my fingers over the faded ink, piecing together fragments of a life that had been cut short. Clara's words were filled with longing and sadness, emotions that seemed to echo my own. She had written about feeling trapped, about wanting more than the life she had been given. A strange connection to her formed in my mind, as though we were bound by invisible chains, both of us longing for something beyond our reach. Suddenly I heard a noise behind me, the soft creak of floorboards. I spun around and there stood Nathan, leaning against the doorframe, watching me with that same intense gaze. My pulse quickened and my breath caught in my throat. "You're here again," he said, a faint smile on his lips. Drawn to her secrets just like I was. I closed the diary, feeling exposed, as if he had caught me in the act of doing something forbidden. "I just wanted to understand," I said quietly, unsure of how else to explain myself. Nathan walked toward me slowly, his movements deliberate, almost measured. "And what have you understood, Mia?" His voice was low and smooth, carrying a hint of something unspoken. I hesitated, searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. "She felt trapped," I finally replied. Nathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yes," he murmured. "And you?" His question took me by surprise and a blush crept up my neck. "No, I don't know," I stammered, flustered. "Why are you asking me that?" He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on mine. "Because you remind me of her," he said softly. "You have that same look in your eyes, like you're searching for something more." My stomach twisted. "Don't compare me to your mother," I responded, my voice firmer than I felt. He smiled, but it wasn't a playful smile. It was something more knowing. "I'm not," he said. "I'm just trying to understand you." We stood in silence for a moment, the air between us charged with unspoken tension. I could feel the pull between us, like the force of magnets, drawing us together despite the distance I knew I should put between us. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor. Then, in a surprising move, Nathan reached out and took my hand. His touch was warm, firm. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice soft but insistent. I wanted to resist, to pull away, but something in his eyes held me there, unable to break free. "Where?" I asked, my voice distant, almost as if it wasn't my own. He didn't answer, just led me out of the library, through the dimly lit hallway, and out into the garden. The cool night air kissed my skin, the scent of roses lingering in the breeze. We stopped under a grand oak tree, its wide branches stretching toward the sky, as if embracing the night. "Why here?" I asked, my heart racing but trying to steady my breath. Nathan turned to face me, his expression serious. "This is where she used to come," he said softly. "My mother. She loved this spot. It was her escape." A lump formed in my throat as I looked at him. "Why are you telling me this, Nathan?" I whispered. He took a deep breath, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "Because I think you're looking for an escape too, Mia," he said quietly. "And maybe I'm that escape." My heart slammed against my chest. "You don't know what you're saying," I replied, trying to stay composed. "I think I do," he said, his voice low and sure. "And I think you know it too." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the world narrowing down to just the two of us. I swallowed hard. "Nathan, we can't," I whispered, my voice trembling. He smiled, that knowing smile again. The same one that had haunted me since the first moment we met. Maybe we already have, he replied, and before I could say another word, he leaned in and kissed me again. This time the kiss was different, slower, deeper, filled with something I couldn't define. But as the kiss deepened, so did the fear inside me. Fear of what it meant, where it could lead, and what I was becoming. I pulled back, breathless, my hands trembling as I tried to regain control. "This is wrong," I said, barely above a whisper. He nodded, but there was no regret in his eyes, just an understanding. "Maybe," he said softly, "but it's also real." I turned away, my thoughts swirling like a storm, emotions raw and exposed. I had crossed a line, and deep down I knew there was no going back. The only question now was how much I was willing to lose to find the truth, and if the truth was even worth it. As I walked back toward the house, the weight of my choices settled heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't sure of anything anymore, except that this was only the beginning of something far beyond my control, and that terrified me more than anything else. The next few days were a blur as I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed. It was just a mistake, a moment of weakness, I kept telling myself. I would forget it, but I couldn't. The memory of Nathan's kiss haunted me, lingering like a ghost in the stillness of the night. And his words, "Maybe I'm that escape," they echoed in my mind, relentless. Oliver returned early from his trip, his unexpected presence both comforting and anxiety-inducing. I tried to act normal, asking about his meetings, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying my face, sensing that something was off. I wondered if he could see the guilt that weighed me down, the secret I was desperately trying to bury. At dinner, his gaze flickered between me and Nathan, who sat at the other end of the table. The tension between us was thick and palpable, and I could feel my heart racing with every passing moment. I forced myself to engage in conversation, but my hands trembled slightly, and I kept my gaze lowered, afraid that if I looked at either of them, my secret would slip out. Afterward, Oliver suggested we take a walk in the garden. I hesitated but agreed, hoping the fresh air would help clear my mind. We walked in silence for a while, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I felt his hand lightly brushing mine, the touch gentle, familiar. But I wondered if he could sense the growing distance between us, if he could feel the cracks in the facade I was desperately trying to maintain. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and cautious. "You seem different, Mia," he said, his concern evident. "Is something bothering you?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "No, nothing," I replied too quickly, too defensively. "Just adjusting to everything, you know. This new life." He nodded, but his expression remained serious. "If there's anything you need to talk about, you know you can tell me," he said gently. "I want you to feel at home here." I forced a smile, trying to reassure him. "I know," I whispered. "Thank you." We continued our walk, but I could feel the weight of his concern pressing down on me. I wanted to tell him the truth, to confess everything, but the words stuck in my throat, held back by fear and shame. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a soft knock at my door startled me. My heart raced, and I knew exactly who it was before I even opened it. Nathan was standing there, his face conflicted, a mixture of resolve and hesitation. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, quickly glancing down the hallway to ensure Oliver wasn't near. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door quickly behind him, my pulse pounding. "Nathan, this is dangerous," I urged, panic creeping into my voice. "Oliver could catch us." He shook his head, an unreadable expression on his face. "I don't care," he responded firmly. "I can't stop thinking about you, Mia. About what we started, about what we did." A cold rush of panic surged through me, mixing with a strange, undeniable thrill. "Nathan, this needs to end," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "This is wrong. You know it's wrong." He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on mine. "I know," he admitted, his tone low and defiant, "but I don't care. You felt it too, didn't you?" "I know you did." I tried to look away, but he reached out and gently cupped my chin, turning my face toward his. "Tell me you didn't feel anything," he said in a voice so raw, almost desperate. "And I'll leave right now." The words died in my throat. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My breath hitched, my chest tight, and I could feel tears welling up, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I hated him at that moment. I hated him for putting me in this position, for making me confront feelings I didn't want to face, for shattering everything I thought I knew about myself. He moved closer, his face dangerously close to mine. I can't stop thinking about you, he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. I know you feel the same. Before I could react, he kissed me again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just passion or desire. It was desperate, urgent, as though it was something we both needed to survive. My body responded involuntarily. My hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, even as my mind screamed for me to stop. But before I knew it, I pulled away, my breath shallow, my heart racing. No, I said, my voice firm and shaky. This has to stop. Nathan looked at me, his face torn between anger and hurt. Why? He asked, his voice rough. Why does it have to end? My voice trembled as I spoke, the words heavy with guilt. Because I began, my chest tight, because I can't live with this. I can't live with the guilt. I love Oliver. I do. And I can't betray him like this. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing with disbelief. But you already have, he said, his words cutting deeper than I expected. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I shook my head, trying to reject the truth in his words. No, I whispered, my voice breaking. Doesn't have to be like this. We can forget it. Pretend it never happened. Nathan's expression hardened, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. You can lie to yourself all you want, Mia, he said softly. But you can't lie to me. You can't pretend you don't want this. You can't pretend you don't want me. A wave of dizziness washed over me, my legs threatening to give way. I felt completely trapped, the weight of the situation bearing down on me. Please, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Just leave. He stood still for a long moment, his eyes locked on mine as if weighing his next move. Finally he nodded, his expression taut. Fine, he said, his voice tight. But this isn't over. You know it isn't. With that he turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. I collapsed on the bed, tears soaking my pillow. I felt broken, torn between two worlds, one with Oliver stable and comforting, and the other with Nathan wild and dangerous. I knew I had crossed a line, one that I could never undo, and that realization left me feeling more lost than ever before. The next days passed in a haze of confusion and fear. I did my best to maintain appearances, to act as though everything was normal. But the walls of the house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Each room was a reminder of my guilt, a symbol of the growing distance between Oliver and me. Oliver began to notice the change in me. His questions were sharper, more probing, his gaze more watchful. I could feel the tension between us, his growing suspicion. He didn't understand what had shifted, but he could feel it. He was trying to reach me, to understand what was happening. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. For a while, Nathan kept his distance, honoring my request to end things. But I could still feel him everywhere, his presence lurking just beyond the corners of my mind, in the rustling leaves outside my window, in the shadows creeping along the walls. I knew he was still watching, waiting for me to make a move. Then, one afternoon, Oliver confronted me. We were in the drawing room, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I could see the tension in his face, the way his jaw clenched, as he struggled to find the right words. Mia, he began, his voice low, almost pleading. I know something's wrong. I felt it for days, weeks even. You're distant. You're distracted. Please just tell me what's going on. I need to know. My chest tightened. I had been dreading this moment, knowing it was coming. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I could see the hurt in his eyes as he searched my face, trying to find something that could explain the distance growing between us. I stammered, my voice barely audible. I don't know how to explain it, Oliver. I've been confused. His brow furrowed as he took a step closer. What are you confused about? He asked, his voice sharp. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. About us, about everything. I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't even know who I am anymore. I feel like I'm trapped in this house, in this life, lost in a place that's supposed to be home. Oliver reached for me, his hands enveloping mine, warm and steady, but I could feel the guilt burning inside me like fire against my skin. Mia, he said softly, his voice full of concern. Whatever it is, we can fix it. I love you. I married you because I believe in us and what we could be together. But I need you to be truthful with me. Tears stung at the back of my eyes, and I held onto his hands as if they were my last lifeline. But beneath my fear, the truth clawed at me from the inside, threatening to break free. I wanted to tell him everything, to admit all of it, to apologize with every ounce of my being. But the words felt like they were made of glass, sharp and cutting, before they even left my mouth. Just then another voice pierced through the air. Maybe she's confused because of me. I spun around, seeing Nathan standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. His eyes, however, were another story, dark and stormy, like a sky just before a violent thunderstorm. A wave of panic hit me and my chest tightened. "Nathan!" I barely managed to whisper. My voice cracked, desperate. Oliver's face stiffened, his hands tightening around mine. "What the hell is going on, Mia?" he demanded, his voice rising, harsh with fear. "What is he talking about?" I felt like the ground was slipping away beneath me, like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, and everything I had ever known was about to fall into an abyss. "Oliver, please. It's not what you think," I begged, but my words wavered with a tremor of terror. Nathan stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on Oliver, calm but unwavering. "You need to know the truth," he said, his voice steady. But there was something beneath it. Something unspoken, something dangerous. "Mia and we've been..." The world tilted. "No," I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. "Nathan, don't." But he kept talking, unfazed. "We've been getting closer," he said, each word deliberate, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Maybe too close." Oliver's face drained of color, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. I turned to Nathan, my voice pleading now. "Why are you doing this?" I begged, the desperation bleeding through. "I told you it's over." Nathan met my eyes, a flicker of sadness in his expression. "Because it's not over, Mia. It's never been over." The air in the room felt heavier. Oliver's hand slipped from mine, and he took a step back, like the weight of Nathan's words had physically pushed him away. "Is it true?" he rasped, his voice hoarse, the pain seeping through every syllable. Have you really betrayed me?" I felt my breath catch in my throat, and the sobs started to rise, my hands trembling as I tried to hold it together. I don't know how this happened," I confessed, my voice breaking, tears streaming down my face. "I never meant for any of this. I never wanted to hurt you." Oliver's expression shifted from shock to pure, searing anger, hurt flashing in his eyes like a storm breaking. "But you did," he said, his voice quiet, almost deadly. "You did hurt me." A suffocating silence fell between us. The weight of what I had done pressed down on me, suffocating me in the aftermath of my own mistakes. I had betrayed him, the one person who had always loved me, always been there for me. And now I had destroyed everything. Oliver turned his icy gaze toward Nathan. "And you?" he spat. "Why would you do this? What could you possibly want from her?" Nathan's expression remained calm, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter. "Because I love her," he said, his words simple yet heavy with meaning. "I love her, and I couldn't stand seeing her stuck in a life that wasn't meant for her." Oliver's face twisted with pain as he turned back to me, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with emotion. "Is that true, Mia?" His eyes searched mine, pleading for an answer. "Do you love him?" My heart shattered into pieces. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know what I felt anymore. I don't know," I said, my voice thick with tears. "I don't know what I feel anymore." Oliver sagged under the weight of my words, as if a part of him had just broken. "Then there's nothing left to say," he murmured, his voice distant and cold. "I want you both to leave. Now." The finality in his voice pierced through me, leaving me numb. I reached out instinctively, wanting to touch him, to make him understand, but he pulled away sharply. "Don't," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "Just go." Nathan moved toward me, his hand finding my shoulder, guiding me toward the door. I stole one last glance at Oliver, just hoping to see some glimmer of forgiveness in his eyes. But all I saw was the raw, unrelenting pain. We walked out together. Nathan's hand on my shoulder was the only thing anchoring me to reality. But I felt hollow, disconnected from everything I had once known. My life, my world had shattered in seconds, and now there was nothing left but a dark road ahead. leading away from everything I had once loved. As we reached the driveway, the weight of regret hit me like a physical blow, nearly bringing me to my knees. What have I done? I whispered, my voice barely audible, cracking under the pressure. Nathan turned to me, his gaze softening, but there was a strange emptiness in his eyes. You made a choice, he said quietly. You chose something different. Something real. But his words rang hollow in my ears. I realized in that moment that by choosing this path, I had lost everything. My past, my future, everything I had once believed in. And I wasn't sure if I could ever find my way back. The weight of my choices crushed me, unrelenting, unforgiving. The future stretched out in front of me like an empty abyss, and I realized I had crossed the point of no return. Now, all that remained was to face the consequences of what I had become.